Hey everybody, Father Jason here. I am the rector of the Church of the Nativity, and this season of Advent, we are, as a congregation, reading the Gospel of Luke together. There are 24 chapters in the Gospel of Luke, so if you start on December the 1st and read one chapter a day, you will finish on Christmas Eve, on December the 21st. So we're doing that as a whole congregation, and I'm doing these video reflections to help in that process. So I invite anyone that sees these to join with us in reading the Gospel of Luke one chapter at a time this year. I want to give you just a quick outline of the chapter. In case you're wondering, I'm using a New Revised Standard Version translation, but any translation that you prefer and that you normally use for study and meditation will work just fine. But let's dive in. Let's do a brief outline. So there's kind of four parts to chapter one. There's the prologue, which is a dedication. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then we get a story about the conception of John the Baptist. And then we get a story about the conception of Jesus. And then we get the story of the birth of John the Baptist. So there's just a few things I want to highlight in those sections. First, in the prologue, in verse 3, it says, "I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." Now, Theophilus is not a Hebrew name. It's a Greek name, combining two words, theos, which means God, and philos, which means love. So it's written to a lover of God. May have been an actual person. There was a tradition in those days of dedicating your book to the patron who commissioned it or was helpful in getting going, or it could just mean that Luke is writing to an audience of Greeks who love God. That will come back more and more as we read through the whole book. However, then we get the story of John the Baptist being conceived and then the story of Jesus being conceived. And the contrast between these two stories is very interesting. The story for the conception of John the Baptist is very Jewish. It's like Isaac, it's like Samson, it's like Samuel. John the Baptist is born to a couple who are older and barren. They don't have any children. And Elizabeth and her husband Zacharias they've never had children, and they're too old. They're beyond childbearing age. We see the same thing happen with Isaac, with Abraham and Sarah. We see the same thing happen with Samson. We see the same thing happen with Samuel and their birth stories. So an important person in Jewish tradition, this is how they're born. By God's grace, giving a child to a couple late in life. Jesus's story is different. Jesus, as you know, is quite popularly known, was born to a very young woman, likely a virgin, something called the Immaculate Conception, if you will. That story of God, of someone conceiving by the power of a God, is way more Greek. We find that over and over again in stories about important people in Hellenistic culture. The one that stands out the most is Alexander the Great, who had conquered a few hundred years before Jesus, had conquered this area where Jesus is born, the area that we call Israel, Palestine now. Alexander had then Hellenized, went through a program of Hellenization for this area of the world. Indeed, in the time of Jesus, by the time of Jesus, all commerce was done in Greek. So likely Jesus spoke Aramaic, he spoke Hebrew, and probably spoke and could read and maybe even write Greek as well. That's just how he would have needed to know that in order to do business as a carpenter. Which was his father's trade. So assuming that Jesus learned that trade as well. So we get this story. We got to remember, Luke is writing to a Greek audience, and then he gives this story of Jesus being born in a way that is way more similar to that of Alexander the Great than to that of other famous people and other important figures in Jewish history. Now, let me be very clear. I am not saying that Jesus wasn't Jewish. No, Jesus is Jewish, period. No doubt about it. Later on, Luke does a genealogy going all the way back to Adam. Jesus is Jewish. We see in the story of what we call the Annunciation, of the angel visiting Mary and telling her that the Holy Spirit is going to bring her with child, that God is going to impregnate her. We hear Mary respond, "Here I am." That is the traditional response of a prophet to God's call. We hear Isaiah say that. We hear Samuel say that. We hear other prophets. That's what they say. "Here I am," when God calls them to do scary and frightening things, and this is very scary and frightening for Mary. So she gives the traditional Hebrew response, and later we'll see Jesus's Jewishness even more dramatically displayed. I'll save that for later as we read on through. So the end of near the end of the book, of the first chapter, we get John the Baptist being born, and we get the Song of Zechariah. Before that, we had the song, the Magnificat, and it's Mary's song in response to the angel, what the angel tells her. Both of these are very famous. That's why I like to call the Gospel of Luke the music theater gospel. Because every now and then people just burst into song, especially in these first few chapters. So it's very dramatic. So keep your eye out for that. However, we have this very John the Baptist presented in this as a great person within the true Jewish tradition, and Jesus, his birth story is Greek, and we're seeing this theme already emerging in the first chapter of how Jesus relates to Jews and to Gentiles, especially Greeks, Jews and other people of the Hellenized world of that time. That's going to be a major theme throughout the book. So we always want to see and pay attention to the way Jesus is interacting with his fellow Jews and the way Jesus is interacting with Gentiles, and see what's going on as we move through the book. And then at the end of the chapter, John the Baptist is born, and it says the child grew and became strong in the spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the day he appeared publicly in Israel. So there we get some foretelling of what's going to come later about John the Baptist. Tomorrow we will dive into chapter 2. I hope you'll check out that as well, and I hope you'll join with me in reading the Gospel of Luke one chapter at a time. And if you feel up to it, come join us at Church of the Nativity sometime. We'll be discussing the Gospel of Luke through art and music and drama, the way artists and musicians and have used themes from the Gospel of Luke and presented them. We'll be doing that on Sundays during our 9:30 Sunday school hour, so you're more than welcome to come on out to that at the Church of the Nativity in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful evening and a blessed and holy Advent, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.